So glad to see so many of you here. This afternoon and evening we have a really special treat. We have music from Georgia. That's not the place just outside Atlanta. It's the Republic of Georgia, which is on the Black Sea. Has borders with Turkey, Russia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. A very old culture, very interesting musical traditions. At 7 p.m., the student chant choir of Tbilisi Ecclesiastical University will be performing right in this space both sacred music and folk music of Georgia. The Georgian Orthodox Church is in communion with the Ecumenical Patriarchate and celebrates the Byzantine Rite, for those of you who know what that is, but with a very different musical tradition from the Greek and Slavonic music that we may be familiar with. There are also very important and interesting folk music traditions in Georgia, some of which we'll hear later tonight. Right now, we have an opening lecture by the world expert, the leading authority on this tradition, John Graham. He has been bringing Georgian choirs to the United States and to other countries, including India, for a very long time, which is how I met him. I met him at a concert or something like this in the United States. I could see he was very serious about the Georgian musical tradition. He'd fallen in love with it. He was even going so far as to learn the Georgian language, which is a very difficult language. It's not a member of the Indo-European group. It has absolutely no cognates with English. That's how committed John was. He was learning it. He spent a considerable amount of time there, leads tours to the monasteries in the mountains and various other things like that. At the time I met John, he had a BA from Wesleyan University in ethnomusicology and was wondering where to go next. I helped arrange for him to come to Princeton, where he ended up writing a dissertation called The Transmission and Transcription of Georgian Liturgical Music. Here it is. It's the longest, fattest dissertation I've ever had the pleasure of advising. The discography and bibliography alone is more than 50 pages. I told him he could get 2 books out of it, which is what he's now working on. But he has published many articles in various places, and he's given a great many lectures, concerts, pre-concert lectures, etc., including in places like the Library of Congress, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Notre Dame Center in Rome, University of Chicago, and so on. He was a fellow at Yale Institute of Sacred Music a couple of years ago. And among other things, he's working on editing an 8-volume anthology, which will include 1,000 Georgian chants. Do not miss this publication when it comes out on Amazon. Right. Meanwhile, perhaps there's no more for me to say. His lecture tonight the title is Introduction to Georgian Studies. Please welcome John Graham.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Peter. Lovely introduction, and I hope I don't feel too far away if I talk from here. I'm kind of tied to the computer a little bit to run through the slideshow. So what I want to do tonight is, as introductions to this, introduce the field of Georgian Chant Studies, which doesn't have very many members, but those of us that are involved are very committed and deeply invested. So, a few things about Georgian chant. It is the song prayers of the Georgian Orthodox Church. It dates to the medieval period or earlier. We know the first priests that brought Christianity to Georgia came in the early 4th century. It was transmitted, the music was transmitted through oral tradition for all those centuries up until it was written down. The music was written down really for the first time in the 1880s, and we'll talk more about that. It has a medieval neume notation system, which was the first time it was notated, or there was an attempt to create a graphic symbol system for the music of the chant. But that medieval neume notation system is yet undeciphered. We don't know how to read it exactly. As I said, it was transcribed in Western notation. It was suppressed in the 20th century. If you were caught singing this traditional liturgical chant, Siberia for you. So now we have a revival in the post-Soviet period, which is what I want to conclude the talk with today. We talk about what is involved in this revival since 1990. What are the main sources for our revival, and how does it come about that we have this group of young people that are going to sing the concert tonight? What are we singing? What are the sources? How are people inspired? And why it's so important for Georgian identity and culture to sing this traditional polyphonic tradition. So about the music, it's a 3-voiced polyphonic tradition. It's sung in close harmony, and it used to be sung in a non-tempered tuning system. So for those of you interested in things like tuning, there's a lot to get involved in and interested here. The main way that we know this is that there are some early 20th century audio recordings. So those recordings are of singers that didn't know Western music. They hadn't learned music via tempered scale instruments like a piano, and they were singing in their own tuning system, which made the transcription of their music into Western notation quite difficult. And that's why some of the sources that we're using to revive this tradition are a little bit challenging. There's some problems with them, especially in choosing which key to sing it in, whether to add a natural or a sharp or a flat in front of the note. That makes a big difference. So those are some of the things that I wanted to mention about Georgian chant right off the bat. Any questions? Okay, I'll just keep rolling. But I do want to have a question and answer session at the end, so please keep track of what you're interested in, and we'll get into that later. So Georgia's here. It's stuck between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. You can see from the orange that it's quite mountainous. To the north, there's the Great Caucasus Range with peaks at 18,000 feet. And to the south, you have what's called the East Anatolian Plateau, or the Lesser Caucasus. And this is a huge mountainous region full of valleys. Some of the places look like Utah Canyonlands, and others places look like Wyoming with pine forests going up from river valleys. And this is the Eastern Anatolian Plateau, and that includes all of Armenia, where you see in the middle with the lake. And Eastern Turkey, and southern Georgia. Azerbaijan here to the right is the green area down towards the Caspian Sea. This is a linguistic map. It's complicated, very complicated. Orange is Russian, purple is Georgian, and the blue tone areas are Turkic languages. And in between, you have all kinds of small languages that are spoken by very few people. There are some 65 languages in the Caucasus, and half of them are not Indo-European. Some of them are Iranic languages, some of them Turkic, some of them Slavic. And the Georgian group is among those that are not Indo-European. It's unclear when people migrated to the Caucasus. There is no migration story or origin story. Georgians feel like they've always been there. So now we'll flip to another map here. This has to do with medieval Christian monasteries. Greetings. And you'll see the cluster up there, which is Georgia, between the Black Sea and the Caspian. But I want to bring your attention to the other little circles, which were Georgian monasteries abroad. So I bring this up because I want to point out that Georgians weren't confined in their own land. In the Christian period, especially in the so-called golden era of Georgian history, 10th, 11th, 12th centuries before the Mongols came, Georgian monastics spread out all over the Christian world. They were supported by nobles, by monarchs, and there were monasteries, as you can see, throughout the Holy Land, on Mount Sinai, in Cyprus, in Antioch, the great Ekaterine monastery on Mount Athos, in Greece, near Thessalonica, and this cluster of monasteries, especially numbers 9 and 10, if you can see them, are right there in what's now Turkey, in the northeast corner of Turkey, but this was the so-called Renaissance, the nest where Georgian monasticism and scriptoria had a rebirth in the 9th century because eastern Georgia was overrun by Arabs. In short, very complex history, but I wanted to point out that particular region in Turkey, what's now in Turkey, because that's where there was this rebirth of hymnography, and so the main chant sources that we have were written in the scriptoria there in the monasteries. There was kingdom called Talpajeti, it's now in Turkey. This is one of them, and it's a hymnologion. It's a collection of small praise chants called irmoi, and there are thousands of them. And because they were being actively translated from Greek, most of the authors of these texts were Greeks, and because there were so many of them, they needed to be collected and bound and organized into these large volumes called hymnologion. So this is one of them. This one is particularly interesting because we know the author. It's someone named Mikhail Lodvikiri. We know the date. It was written between 978 and 988. We know where it was written in a place called Shatbin Monastery, which is a complete ruin nowadays, but it once held this magnificent scriptorium. And, very interesting for us, it's full of new notation. So we know that they were singing these irmoi, they're meant to be sung texts, and you can see the texts are in black, and then the little red symbols above and below the text, which is quite unusual, signify the musical melodies that these texts should be sung to. Now, the reason I said in the beginning that they haven't been deciphered yet is we don't know precisely what melodies they were singing. So they were singing these texts, but we don't know what melodies they were. The symbols told the master chanter, who already had the melodies in mind, where to start the melody and where to end the melody. But if you don't know the melody, we've lost the key. So what I've done here in the little zoom in is to show that there are some things that we can learn about these notes. For example, the 4 lines that you see are from 4 different texts. This is the final phrase of each of those texts. And you can see that the neumes fall into certain groupings. If you look on the right-hand side, you'll see that there's kind of a squiggly red line underneath and then a straight red line underneath. That was some sort of cadential formula. So we know that at least these 4 texts were sung to the same melodies because the neumes are grouped into a similar fashion. So this is some information that we can gather from these types of manuscripts and others. You can do kind of statistical analysis and groupings to figure out how these texts were arranged and what melodies they were sung to, and then scholars that are capable of this, like Peter, can compare them to Greek or Latin manuscripts and find out if the modal assignments of this or that text align with the modal assignments of that text as it occurs in Greek or Latin manuscripts. So there's a lot to do. It's a wide open field, and we need good scholars in Georgian Chant Studies. Okay, moving on. So there's 4 areas that I want to cover in this talk, and I'll give you a teaser. We're going to have some live chant here, and I'm also going to ask you to chant later. So that will be coming up when we get to regional harmony. So first, let's talk a little bit about the preservation efforts to save this music. The reason that it needed to be saved is because there was constant invasion in Georgia and suppression of Georgian culture. But, interestingly, when the invaders were Muslims, the Christians tended to hold on to their culture even more strongly. So chant and folk music survived better, almost, under Muslim invasion because the Muslims would come in, they would take over the army. I'm talking about, say, Qajar Persians in the 1600s, 1700s. And they would leave governor generals, but then they would go home. And then so the Georgians were able to keep their cultural intact. So something changes in 1801, which is when Orthodox Russia, the Tsarist Empire, arrives, and they came as Orthodox Christians. So they were able to gain access to Georgian institutions, Georgian churches, Georgian priests, on a trust basis, having the same religion, but they ended up being more of a colonial empire than a religious sort of brotherhood. So this was a fraught relationship, and it was because the Russian Orthodox Church itself was under tight control from the Tsar and the Tsarist bureaucracy. So they disbanded the Georgian Orthodox Church. The last patriarch of Georgia was taken into exile in Russia in 1810. And all of the institutions in Georgia where chant used to be taught, like the seminaries, they were disbanded. Instead of 35 dioceses, the Russians appointed 5 pro-Russian bishops that they could control. This is in 1810, 1815. And they took all the money back to Petersburg and redistributed it according to the goals of the empire, which did not include teaching Georgian chant. So while there was a revival in the late 1700s, the early decades of the 1800s, we see a decline in the transmission of Georgian chant. Because it was at that time that master chanters were teaching in seminaries, they were teaching in the major monastic centers and the urban cathedral centers. All of this was taken over by the Orthodox Russian exarchs and bishops. Now, I should say that there were some Russian exarchs, the sort of appointed bishops at the time, who loved Georgian chant. We know of one named Mose in 1832. We have some quotes, and he was very keen on learning more about Georgian Orthodox culture, the frescoes, the church architecture, the chant. Unfortunately, he was only exarch for 2 years. And a lot of the others that came didn't like Georgian chant at all. They said, "Why are you singing? It sounds like the bleating of a goat," said one and you should be singing God's hidden Slavonic chant. Okay, so this was the more typical attitude of the Russian imperial representatives of the Russian Orthodox Church in Georgia throughout the 1800s, and that resulted in a decline in oral chant tradition, such that by the 1860s, we have this figure in the picture. He's a Georgian nationalist from an aristocratic family, a metropolitan of the Orthodox Church, and he founded this committee for the preservation of Georgian church chant precisely because they couldn't find chanters to sing in major services. There was a dearth of skilled chanters who knew all the chants for all of the obscure services that happened every week throughout the year. So we founded this committee. Now let me show you a few photos just for fun about the environment that he was living in Tbilisi. This is Tbilisi also from this period, maybe a little later, 1880s, 1890s. Here you see the river in flood with all of the wheelhouses out in the river. Here is the Svetitskhoveli Cathedral, the main kind of Westminster of Georgia, where coronations of kings and queens happen, funerals and the burials of the monarchs happen in this great cathedral. Here's another cathedral in downtown Tbilisi, dating from the 14th century, where the patriarchs served for 6 centuries. So this is kind of some snapshots, some views of this area. So Bishop Alexander forms the committee, and his main idea was to reinsert energy into the oral transmission of chant. In other words, to hire teachers to gather students to teach the oral tradition and to preserve that method of transmitting Georgian chant. Unfortunately, after a couple of decades, they realized this wasn't really working. They needed something else. The last master chanters were growing old. They were dying. And one was Ghvtisa, dies in 1880, and that was a great loss because even though he had taught his sons fairly well, they all said, "We're nothing compared to our father, who was a true master chanter." So he's considered one of the last of the master chanters in Tbilisi area of East Georgia. So they turned their attention towards trying to use Western notation to transcribe the music that was an oral tradition as a form of preserving chant. So first I'll show you a personal notebook of Ekaterine, who's an important figure in the preservation of Georgian church chant. First, he was trying to learn the oral method of chant. So he would sit with his friends at the foot of a master chanter in the 1880s and learn chant. He would write the text, which is on a horizontal line, written from left to right. But above the text, you see lots of little squiggles. You see dashes, little hooks, little circles, lines next to each other. In the second line, you see little, it looks like 4 cups in a row going up. This was his own shorthand for rhythmic notation. Each symbol represents a beat, and some of the symbols have to coincide with vowel sounds. The little cups are the E sound, so when he writes 4 of these, it means sing E for 4 beats, or sing E on 4 different notes. Okay, so after a short time, there began the first experimentation with Western notation. Now, of course, by the 1880s, Western notation has been around for centuries, but not in Georgia. Okay, so in the Tsarist Empire, they built an opera house. There were musicians coming from Europe, Italian singers, orchestral players, and so forth. So there were knowledgeable musicians circulating in Tbilisi, but not necessarily in the same circles as the master chanters who were involved in the Georgian Orthodox Church. Many of them were rural, outside the city, and their connection was really through these bishops. So the first picture I showed of Alexander Okropididze, the one who formed the committee, he had contacts to the intelligentsia and therefore to Western Pascalism. And he was constantly searching for people who would take time away from their regular work to come and sit with these master chanters and try to transcribe their chant. So his first approach were to basically anyone who knew notation. One famous person was Ippolitov Ivanov, the Russian composer who taught at a music school in Tbilisi in the 1880s for 10 years before becoming a professor at Moscow Conservatory. And he notated about 400 chants from this man pictured, Siqvarulman, and his brothers. And those chants, they sat in a censor's office for about 10 years, but were eventually published in 1898. Vasil himself, kind of fed up with the slowness of the censorship process, went to Moscow, taught himself notation, and then spends the rest of his life notating his own chants. So here's, sorry, it's a little bit blurry, but we'll zoom in a little bit and show you. This is the ear voice for Epiphany. Since we're in this Epiphany period, I thought I'd choose this one. You can see his process here. He starts with the top voice. He hasn't done the bass voice yet. So they always notated the top voice first, and that's because that's the canonical melody that's passed down through oral transmission. It's the most important voice part in Georgian chant. And the middle and lower voice parts are kind of harmonizing voices that can change based on the region that you're in. But the top voice is sacrosanct in a way. You're not allowed to change it. So he starts with the top voice. Now, I'll show you a different variant of that same chant. This one is transcribed by Ghvtisa. After Ippolitov Ivanov moved back to Russia, Okropididze, the bishop, was looking for other people that would help, that would dedicate themselves fully. And this man, Ghvtisa, answered the call, so to speak. He was a famous opera singer. He had a great career going already. He sang in La Scala in Italy, he sang in Petersburg. He was on the circuit. He came back to Tbilisi ostensibly just to visit, but he met Okropididze, who convinced him that as a Georgian patriot, he really needed to dedicate his musical talents to transcribing the Orthodox chant tradition, which was in danger of being lost. And so, starting in 1881, Ghvtisa moves to Tbilisi and begins transcribing. And he spends the rest of his life, up until 1911, so a good 25 years, he spends notating about 5,000 pages of chant. And this is the bulk of the collection of chant that we have today. So here you see a rough draft copy of this Epiphany Yearmos. And you can see now we have 3 voice parts, top, each voice part taking up its own staff. It's very quickly scribbled. It would have 3 singers singing in front of them. And each time they sang the chant, they would have sung it slightly differently because these chants weren't fixed. They weren't photographs. It was an oral tradition of improvisation. And one, as a good chanter, one was expected to embellish and ornament the model melodies. So I can only imagine this process, listening to the singers and then saying, wait, you're singing a different chant. No, we're not. He said, yes, you sang it this way before, and he played it on his piano. And they said, what? That sounds totally bizarre. The piano don't play that. They're singing their own tuning system. So it must have been quite a process. But eventually, he managed to find a way to work with the master chanters. So some of his transcriptions were published, and this is the publication of that same Irmos that comes out in the first publication was 1895, and they had a short run. They published 5 books before the press folded in 1910, right before Corby's dies, actually 1911. So that's kind of my summary of the transcription movement. There are a lot of other actors involved, lots of different traditions. I didn't even talk about the master singers themselves who lived in rural villages all throughout the mountains in Georgia. Many of them are in their 70s or 80s and dying during this decades, and when they go to the grave, taking their traditions with them. We know that there were a lot of other chant systems in Georgia that were never recorded. That no one like Ghvtisa ever went there and was able to transcribe their chant. The chant in Svetitskhoveli or Gacha or Svaneti, these complete mountain regions that had their own musical systems where we have folk music. We don't have any chant because people didn't go there to transcribe it when they were still good masters. So those are the transcriptions. Now we also have sources in the audio sphere. We have the English Gramophone Company that comes to Georgia in 1902, and their mission was to sell gramophones. So their strategy was to record local musicians that they thought would be popular, and then to sell the gramophones and say, if you buy the gramophone, we'll give you 5 free discs, and it'll be your favorite musicians. Sounds familiar. So the engineers would travel around and try and locate the most popular singers and record them. They were not ethnomusicologists. They didn't go systematically and get a sample of this choir from this village and a sample from that choir and make sure that we have gender balance and age balance and different repertory. No, they didn't care. They didn't know about that. So the recordings that we have, which are a treasure, we're lucky to have anything, they're a little bit skewed. For example, there's about 100 recordings from 1902 to 1914 before World War I, and about 80 of them are from one village in West Georgia. I don't really know why, but maybe the engineers love that music. So here is something of the scene. Now this is this is his recording device. It's done on a hand crank, so he had to make sure that he didn't speed up or fall in it because that would change the tempo of the recording. We actually have this recording, so this is, what I wanted to say is also out of those 100 recordings, 95 and a half are folk music. We have 4.5 chants. So they were not focused on religious music at all. I guess they didn't think they were going to be able to sell religious music because they didn't record it. And the ones that we have are just at the very end of their wax cylinders. Now, we have 10 more seconds, so what do you want to sing? And they would start a chant and then the recording would run out. So you have to just at the very beginnings of each chant. So here's the first half of this beautiful chant that we had as sung by this trio. We know who they are. Tbilisi trio is what they were called, cousins, and here's the recording. you can hear, even though it's a little scratchy, you can feel it's an old recording, you can sense that they're singing in their own tune system. There's a little out of tune to us, also to Western ear. The harmony is completely different. The potential note is completely unexpected, for example. So it's really a different audio world, a different harmonic sensibility that they have. And it's lucky that we have those audio recordings because it tells a lot more information about the actual performance practice of this music than just the transcriptions. The transcriptions, yes, we have thousands of pages of them, very important. Even just as one audio recording like this tells us what tempo they sang at, what timbre, when they breathed, the tuning system, all kinds of information that wasn't written down in the transcription itself. So now let's go on a little bit to talking about the transcriptions themselves and the editing process that happened. We'll just breeze through this really quickly. So here we're looking at a chant for Easter, and this is a rough draft. It was then put into good copy by PD1 Quarterly, or I just showed the photo of who made these transcriptions. And you can see the area that I circled, and then someone comes in with a pencil and crosses it out and changes some things. So these transcriptions were already faulty in terms of not being a one-to-one match with what was being sung. And then they were further edited before the publication process. And then even in the publications, there's sort of a little addendum at the end of errata, mistakes that happen in the publication. And I say all these things to mention that when we look at these sources, we have to understand that they're not exactly the way that they were singing before. They are a window in which we can investigate what was being sung. It was an oral tradition, first thing to remember. Every time they sang a chant, it would be slightly different. So what we need to decipher, or what we need to figure out is what is unchanged, what stays stable in an improvisational tradition. So just looking at a few more things. First, here's another issue with the transcriptions having to do with the tuning system. If you looked at the box chord, you have an A, and then in the middle line a G, and in the bottom line a D. So it gives you this chord that's very common in Georgian chant. The upper two voices are a whole tone apart. I won't say dissonant because it's the Georgian tone. Over a bass that's a ba-da-boo, something like that. The problem here is the ficta. So they have A flat and D flat, but no G flat. So instead of that nice chord I just sang, it would be da-da-da, and you have a half step in the top and a tritone down below, very unfamiliar chords in Georgian. Definitely wouldn't have been something like that. So nowadays, as scholars come back, we look at these transcriptions from 100 years ago, we have to edit them, to publish them, and we have to make choices about how to edit this. Are we going to add a G flat? Well, that's going to screw up some other things later in the line. So it really takes a lot of expertise to learn how to do things. Just to give you a sense of the quantity and scale, we have, this is like one of the chant books that was copied by this man, Ekaterine, and he copied it because many chants were unfinished when they were transcribed from the master chanters. For the sake of time, because the master chanters were old, they would only transcribe the top voice, the most important voice. And they didn't transcribe all three voice parts. So Ekaterine recopied those into the big, thick books, 1,000 pages long like that. And he took them to this priest named Shemokmedi, and he showed him these single line melodies like I have here. This is just the first voice going across, so you know three-voice harmony. So what Ekaterine did, and I forgive you if you don't remember all these names, that's what Peter said to me right in the beginning of the dissertation. Why does everyone's name start with K? So Ekaterine took that first voice melody, placed it in the top line, and leaves two lines blank underneath. Okay, then he took it to the priest who still knew chant. He said, could you complete these chants? So here we see this process. Here's the same chant, and now the second line has been filled in a different handwriting. Those of you with eagle eyes can see that the stems are different. The second voice is a little more loosely written. The stems are not straight up and down. So part of my dissertation work was trying to figure out who was writing which voice part in these manuscripts. So in a lot of manuscripts, there's 4 different handwriting. But there's no writing per se, it's just the notation. So this becomes the inroad. You have to learn how, I mean, look at the difference between this stem going up here from Ekaterine, who's a scribe and very detail-oriented, perfect circle, perfect line straight up here. The priest, he's a master chanter and he's in a rush. Quick scribble, takes no extra time. So for me, they're very different handwritings. Here we go. Ekaterine, the monk with the manuscripts, he didn't like the harmonizations from Rajnan, the priest. And so he writes in, actually right here, he writes in the liner notes here, right down at the bottom where the red arrow is. This is Ekaterine to the priest saying, Father Rajnan, if you please, would you please look at these entrance to the temple, Irmoy once again. I don't think that they're harmonized well. Could you make it a little more complicated? Okay, because if you look at the second voice, it's completely parallel thirds with the top voice. And Georgian chant is has the potential to be a lot more polyphonic possibilities for how we render it. When Georgians sing, they don't typically sing in parallel thirds, but the priest was concerned that new chanters wouldn't be able to learn complicated chant. So he tried to dumb it down and make it as simple as possible. But the monk didn't like it, so he's saying, could you please redo these? And here's the response in the margin over here, and he says, Father Ghvtisa, I went back through and sang all these chants, and I find them to be perfectly suitable already. Signed, Father Archon. In other words, I'm not doing it again. And we know Ghvtisa wrote a 80-page memoir much later in 1936, describing all these relationships. So we know their relationships and how they were both invested in preserving Georgian chant, but they came from two different aesthetic perspectives. Okay, so then Ghvtisa, since he didn't like parallel thirds everywhere, he took these chant books, all of them, like big fat ones like that, maybe 10 of them, and took them to other chanters and said, could you help me change them a little bit? So if you look at this one where the boxes are, you see a third person's handwriting come in. He's erased the parallel thirds and he's added little simple counterpoint gestures. Instead of the parallel thirds, it's taken away with little rising lines like that, which become, when you've gone through hundreds of pages of this, become a signature. So the person that changed this parallel thirds was the Ghvtisa Nikolaidze, and he always changed it with these types of rising lines, that kind of thing, that kind of thing. You see it all through the manuscripts. Okay, so moving on, you can see that sometimes they had to edit the manuscript so radically that even the final cadence pitches were changed. Originally here you see an E in all three voices, and now it's been changed to an F. So the final cadence note is supposed to be one of the major fundamental building blocks of the model melody that cannot be changed. That and the number of beats to get there. From the starting pitch to the cadence pitch, how many beats it takes, and those two, the starting pitch and ending pitch, are the things that really cannot be changed. Otherwise, it becomes a different chant. If you think of like other improvisational music systems, like a jazz standard, for example, there's a melody and there's a chord progression. If you change one of those, then you're starting to get in the territory of being another song. Right? So there's some fundamental things that you need as a structure to be able to improvise. So these things are really checked. In the manuscripts, you can see even those were sometimes omitted. All right, now we get into some regional differences. And this is an important aspect of Georgian scholarly studies. And I hope I haven't bored you to tears. How's our energy level here? Are you still with me? I promise we're going to have the singers in just a minute. Okay, so quickly about regional differences. Think like Roman chant versus Milan versus Gallic chant. We have three major schools in Georgia who have the model melodies that's passed down through oral tradition, but harmonize them in totally different ways. They harmonize them according to their own musical sensibilities that have to do with the regional three-part harmony folk music. So, in a nutshell, we have Eastern Georgia, which is 456. That's where the capital city is, Tbilisi. And the West Georgia, they're separated by a low mountain range called the Gelati range. And then you have number 3, which is Gelati monastery, and that's where we have most of the chants from. And number 1 is also similar to Gelati, but significantly different in its harmonic parts, so that's what we call the third school, and that's the Shemokmedi. So I've chosen one chant, the troparion to St. Nino, the light of the Georgians, important saint, and actually it's her feast day right around now. We celebrate her feast day is January 14th, and since Georgian Orthodox Church is on the old calendar, we celebrate on the 22nd. So I chose this chant. And the first thing I'd like to do is, if you can see this melody, maybe we can sing it together. What's that do? Can you all see this? Okay. So, I put just the first voice because, as I've alluded, this is the canonical, sort of standard model melody. And as a student of chant, you learn from your teacher and you are not allowed to change. So, let's sing this together. Don't worry about the words. We sing it on loud. We'll just start from there. Okay, ready? And then you hear this melody over and over again, and they don't teach you the second and third voice part. You have to learn it by ear. Okay, so if you learn this melody, then how are you going to harmonize? How are you going to harmonize with the second and third voice? Well, you use whatever's familiar to you, whatever your local harmony is, whatever you're hearing on a daily basis from folk songs that accompany all walks of life, from waking up to working in the fields to morning rituals, to marriage rituals, in the evenings in the long winters, historical ballads that could go on for half an hour, and so forth and so on. So in each of the 12 regions of Georgia, the harmony in the folk music is quite different. And that's why we see a lot of variation in the second and third voice parts for this melody. And quick, before we sing, when I ask the singers to sing those, I'll show you that the way that scholars can study these things is we break down all the model melodies, the first voice, into units like this. And what we just sang here is A, C, E, and then F, which happens to be the way this text was set to the available melodies that are assigned to tone 4 Chopin. I'm not going to get into the whole system we have time, but I just suffice to say that if you look down this graph on the left of the titles of chants, you can see that a lot of them have this kind of model melody order. A lot of them go A, C, E to F, yeah? But then they have different, after that you see lots of different patterns or different groupings of melodies like down here. And also down below, number 12, you start to see that this group of chants doesn't go AC, it goes AD. D is another model melody, right? So all these chants here are troparion texts set to tone 4 melodies, but they don't follow the same order of phrase-length melodies. There are about 12 melodies assigned to tone 4, and I just kind of grab that. You have a new text, a new saint coming out. You see that it's an obscure saint next week. You're a master chanter. You take the text, you sort of grab a few melodies, set the text, teach it to your choir. That seems to be the system the way it was. So that's why we have a lot of variation even within troparion tone form. And this is just one of the 8 melodies for troparion. And then we have other genres of chant like Kontakion, earwort, Anubius, and so forth. All right, so now, when we're in Gelati Monastery in central Georgia, this is the way they harmonize that melody that we just sang.
Sitqvisa, Nino, pray to Christ God to have mercy on our souls.
What's the date?
The date?
The date of this text?
Well, she converts the queen of Georgia and then the king in 326 AD, according to the scholars that studied the period. And she reposed sometime after that in Bodh convent, East Georgia. She was a young woman apparently when she came, and she worked miracles and she healed the queen. And there's a hagiography from the 7th century, which is quite short and describes her life. And then this is expanded about 5 times in the 10th century sources. So now, when you look, you can look up the hagiography of St. Nino and like the Georgians online. It's been translated to English, the full story. That's a 10th century sort of expanded version. Okay, so going a little bit towards the Black Sea coast, down towards the Shemokmedi monastery, we have this very important figure named Ekaterine. I would call him the last of the master chanters. Masters were the ones who not only knew the Vespers, Matins, Divine Liturgy services, chants, but knew how to take a text out of the Typicon for, let's say, the Feast of St. Barbara, and say, okay, this is set to tone 4 melodies, where are those melodies, and then set the text and teach a choir, and do that for any chant, all 3 voices, in a simple style, medium style, and ornamental style. So master chanters. They knew this. Artem actually said in an interview in 1949 that he knew 2,500 chants by heart. He didn't know any Western notation in his life, but gratefully, right before he died at the age of 80, they made a number of recordings of him singing chants into a cassette recorder in the Tbilisi Conservatory. No one else alive knew the chants. So he sang the first voice, and then they played it back to him, and he recorded the second voice, and then the third voice. So that's what we have now. Same chant, basically the same melody. You might notice some differences, but take a look at the harmony, which is significantly different from what we were hearing before. Instead of thirds, fifths, octaves, you start to get a lot more fifths stacked on top of each other, fifths and ninths. It's like see what we can observe from this.
Sitqvisa,
towards Tbilisi and further east into viticulture land, where the hillsides are covered in vineyards, and every villager still to this day makes about 3 tons of wine and buried in forests and Gelati. They have, the folk music is mostly drone polyphony, so the basses sing the long drones, very strident. You'll hear some of that at the concert tonight. And the drones move periodically, but over top you have these 2 soloists singing highly ornamental lines. So the way that this melody is harmonized has to do with that skill set. So you see, they did not really over-ornament the canonical first voice melody. It stays fairly intact. But since the East Georgian soloists are very good at adding little ornaments and passing tones, you'll see that the second voice receives a lot more moving grace notes, a lot more movement, especially in the 3rd line or the end of the 1st line. In cadence, cadential moments, you see a lot of extra passing tones in the East Georgian chant tradition. It has to do with this folk poetry, that's the context. Likewise, because the basses in East Georgian folk music are used to singing drones, they weren't very versatile. They didn't, as West Georgian, what we just heard, the bass was all over the place. He sings a full octave in range. He has no problem moving or jumping in order to hit the right chords that they like in West Georgia with those the ninth interval below the melody. You'll never hear the 9th interval below the melody in East Georgia. They just don't like that chord. They don't like the Western Georgian folk music and vice versa. Only in Tbilisi choirs do they sing both. When we get the regional world people, they sometimes turn up their nose at that other regional folk music. It's really not their taste. I'm exaggerating a little bit. But the point is that they love their own style of folk music. So the basses here in East Georgia, you see the bass part is quite simple. And it's just moving between a 5th below the melody to an octave below the melody to a 5th below the melody to the cadence. Fairly straightforward to improvise this. So really in East Georgian chant, the middle voice gets a lot of the improvisational insight. So let's listen to this final variant.
Sitqvisa,
last little section of the talk, were there any questions about this regional harmony?
In terms of transmission, were there problems with language as well? We were talking about somebody chanting from the Middle Ages. To modern Georgians, does the medieval Georgian even taught us a language before this can be effectively passed on?
Yeah, it's a great question because say Slavonic to Russian are quite different, or Hellenic Greek to modern, very different. Latin to French, let's say. But Georgian's different in this way. In the 1870s, the so-called nation builders, these Georgian aristocrats that had studied abroad in Paris and Warsaw and St. Petersburg, they came back and they wanted to gain liberation of the Georgian nation. They wanted to create a nation and liberate it from the Tsarist Empire. And the nation builders had a certain template. You can't be a nation unless you speak the same language. Georgia had 4 different languages and 20 or more dialects. People could not understand each other. So one of the first projects of these, I call them the nation builders, was to create a grammar and to say this is Georgian and we're going to teach this in school. And the basis of their grammar was medieval literature. So they actually created a new language, maybe similar to that as radically as recreating Hebrew, let's say. But they created a version of Georgian in the 1870s that uses a lot of liturgical Georgian, classical Georgian, which had been codified in the 10th century. So modern Georgian is closer to 10th century Georgian than it is to the dialects that were being spoken in the 1870s. Does that make sense? It's interesting. So that the modern Georgians can understand their classical Georgian liturgy. There are just a few words that have gone out of usage, and the grammatical suffixes have changed, but in such a way that it's still pretty obvious for people that go to church frequently. They can understand each other. Is that right? Did I just make that up?
Yes.
Getting God's approval. Yes?
I have a question about these melodies. They begin with a recitation, and then there's kind of like a cadence that's more melismatic. Are there any rules about exactly on what syllable the cadence is supposed to begin?
Yes, thank you. Great observation. So like I said, oral tradition. So they would have the text written down in the books. The first thing Master Chanter would have to do is take his text out and divide it into phrases. And usually that comes where there's punctuation. There's a comma here, there's a period there, a semicolon there. Those become the cadences, musical cadences. And but you have, in the melody, you might have only 8 notes in this particular phrase. But in this phrase, you have 14 syllables. So how do you fit 14 syllables to 8 notes? Sing 6 notes as a recitative and then start the melody. That's what they did. The analysis shows. And that there were these reciting tones, typically at the beginning of every phrase, where you could sing 1 syllable or you could sing 25 syllables, as many as needed, and then start your melody so that your punctuation in the text would occur with the cadence. So that where the period in the text is where your musical cadence. Is that clear? Yeah. It's very interesting the way they set the texts to these long melodies. Yeah.
Are these texts metrical? Are they poetic in some way, or is it prose?
Yeah, good question. And that was a big problem for the translators in the 11th century. There's one famous one named Giorgi Mtatsmindeli, or George the Athonite. He has a whole Wikipedia page. He was famous, second abbot of the Ekaterine monastery in respected hierarchy. He argued for the division of the churches, 1054, the Catholic and Orthodox Church. He was one of the few high-ranking hierarchs in the Byzantine Empire that argued for the rapprochement of the 2 churches, which is famous, and his arguments are written in the Catholics. And he was a hymnographer and chanter, and he translated a lot of Greek poetic texts the Greek Iroquois texts were poetic. There were a certain number of syllables that would fit precisely with these melodies that have a certain number of notes that go with a certain number of melodies. But the problem for him was that the Georgian language is totally different from the Greek. And it was impossible for him to get 7 syllables, 8 syllables, 14 syllables, 3 syllables. It just wouldn't work. So, and he writes about that in the margins of his translations and said, I did my best to get as close to the right syllable count, but it didn't work, and the Georgian translation no longer fits with the Greek melody, so I had to write a new Georgian melody. And he's writing that. His dates are 980s, and he dies in 1065. So, in the early part of the 11th century, he did a lot of the translations of the Gospel, but he also did a lot of these Iroquois translations. So that's the answer to your question. The syllable count is not so important as in the Greek poetic ecclesiastical literary church. Yes?
I'm just wondering about, the Georgian literary probably polyphonic tradition, and as it relates to chant, what's current scholarship say about kind of the earliest smoking gun somewhere in the repertoire that says they were definitely singing chant in polyphony starting in Ghvtisa.
Okay. Well, Clayton Parr, you know as well as I do. It's Iwan in Ghvtisa, 11th, 12th century Neoplatonic scholar, taught at Gelati monastery. We have a lot of his commentaries and a lot of his translations, and this is the only real medieval source that scholars know about today. More sources might come about. But he mentions when he's teaching his students about the Trinity, and he's talking about different ways to understand what it is that 3 can be 1. And he uses several analogies, and one of them is musical. And he names 3 voices, Zak, Jir, and Bam. And he says, just like these 3 tones are become 1, so the Trinity is 3 in 1. And that's it. That's all we have. It's just that one sentence. So philologists have tried to decipher what these 3 terms are, Zak, Jir, and Bam, if they were a stringed instrument or if they were voices. There's various opinions on that. But that's the first evidence that polyphony was happening that we have from, say, a material source. But then, if you really get to know Georgian history well and Georgian culture well, it's easy to extrapolate further back because the mountain regions were isolated. They all have 3-part harmony, especially in West Georgia. And they're singing texts that are pre-Christian texts to their own deity of gods. And they were isolated from one another. So if you try and imagine like polyphony originating in, say, the Golden Era, like the 11th century, it's hard to imagine that picture. How would polyphony spread so easily to all these different ethnic groups, dialectical regions, mountain regions, lowland regions that are controlled by Turks, Persians? So it seems like such a unified 3-voice harmony folk tradition originates far before this first 11th, 12th century source. And most Georgian scholars put it back further, and it's hard to say. 6th century, 6th century BC, it's hard to work. Other questions? Yes?
When did women start singing chant?
Who?
Women.
When did women start singing chant? From the beginning. St. Nino's woman. She was definitely singing chant. How else did she proselytize Christianity? So I think from the very beginning, absolutely. And certainly there was a strong tradition of monasticism, and there were nuns from the beginning, and they were singing chant in the convents. So now let me just go through a quick little thing about the modern revival, and then we'll go back to the Q&A. There's some folks in the video soon. So Soviets suppressed the chant tradition. I showed you the manuscripts. We heard the audio recordings. Other sources were lost. The ones that we have were saved by heroic figures like Diasamidze-Graham, who buried his handwritten manuscripts in tin boxes in a monastery underground for years and years. And finally, he released them in old age to a museum curator in 1936 who took these boxes and boxes of handwritten manuscripts, put them in a museum. Good thing, because Ekaterine to that monk, he dies a couple of years later. The curator of that museum gets killed the next year in 1937 purges. So the manuscripts were kind of forgotten. They made it into a library. The Soviets were good at archiving, so they didn't destroy things that were already in libraries, but they were forgotten. And very few people saw these manuscripts for the next 60 years. A couple of scholars gained access, but the general public was definitely not allowed to look at any Orthodox Christian sources. Until 1988, this group of young conservatory students find these manuscripts. They start singing these chants that we're singing in secret. And can you imagine, you're not allowed to sing. I wouldn't be able to give this lecture. You wouldn't be able to attend this lecture because we're talking about religious music. That's how it was just 30 years ago. It's amazing. God was the mind. So they started singing in secret. They gained a blessing from the patriarch to begin chanting in services. Their goal was to bring this chant tradition not to the stage, but back into the religious services. So they got a blessing to sing in this church that's in the background, not just Catholic Church that's in Tbilisi. So this choir has been fundamental to the revival of religious chant. They started producing cassette tapes, CDs. They started publishing books. Members of the choir became musicologists and still remain some of the foremost scholars on Georgian Chant Studies, a generation that all of us that are here consider our teachers, both scholastically and also as practical performers. So this Georgian chant book like this, there's now 8 in this series that I started in 2000. I had the privilege of being an English language editor. There's like one more that comes out in 2 years. Now we have this big new project to come out. We're publishing all the unpublished chants, all the rough drafts, even if there's copies, we're publishing it all. It is a gargantuan project that we're doing right now. So international audiences start getting interested. The New York Times does a story on Georgian chant in 2010. And I introduced the journalist to a number of different singers. Here you see the rehearsal, the young women's guy from the conservatory, our friends. International symposiums start cropping up. There's a lot of interest coming from abroad. So every 2 years there's a big symposium in Tbilisi, and scholars come from all over the world to participate and give papers. International choirs are singing chant in a big way. This is an album that came out a couple of years ago from a 120-person choir in Washington, D.C. called Ekaterine. They performed, or they learned and performed the entire Polyashvili liturgia. It's an hour long piece. Other aspects of the revival, here's a Easter Day march. Don't be frightened like Ku Klux Klan or anything. It's actually mostly children singing Christmas carols, parading through Tbilisi to celebrate Christmas. And this is part of the Orthodox revival that's happened in Georgia. It's hard to overstate how important this has been, especially in the dark ages of the 1990s when the economy collapsed and there's no electricity and there was civil war. People needed something to believe in, and the church was a good way to turn. The patriarch inspired a lot of people to get into art, all different arts. Painting, frescoes, or icons, stone carving, wood carving, learning chants, rebuilding churches, becoming people with scholastic aptitude, go and get degrees. So lots of people were inspired to get into the church arts in the 1990s. Really the patriarch himself with his blessing and inspiration. So we see a bigger revival in the church in Georgia than we do in other post-Soviet countries like Bulgaria or Armenia. Not such a big revival. Young singers now, not just singing in churches, but also on stages. It's become popular to have concerts. We just had one this past week where lots of different young choirs come out, show their stuff. What level of chanting are they at? And all their peers listen to them and record. And our social media is big, so you see videos of all these young people chanting going around on social media. So you really hit it. It's an exciting time. There's all different kind of competing directions for the expression of chant. So the patriarch He also writes his own melodies, and these are simple, beautiful melodies, but some of them have been taken and arranged by composers. So we had one big concert where the patriarch composed a mass, and it was orchestrated for large chorus, orchestra, and operatic soloists, and this was performed on the biggest stage in Tbilisi. There's another expression of chant here that's very diverse. What I find the most fascinating, and where my own research is heading now, and more in the scholastical direction, is the return of chant to the convents and the monasteries, because that's really where it will thrive. It's nuns and monks that are doing services every single day. If they're chanting, then they're the ones that are going to recreate the improvisatory tradition that we've largely lost. Because now young chanters are reading from notation, and so it's hard to improvise when you're just reading. So once you get chant in services happening every single day, I think that it will start to resemble more of the tradition as it was 100 years ago. So as we see nuns chanting and monks chanting, that to me is a signal that the tradition will have a long future and will truly be healthy. So with that, I'll conclude, and if you have more questions, we can talk for a little bit longer.
I'm wondering what percentage of these chants have been digitized, because obviously we have some here. Are they locally published? Are they considered digital archives for these? And what can the average person's accessibility be to these?
So the question is, how many chants have been digitized? Well, actually, right now, they've pretty much all been digitized as of right now, because there's this huge anthology of 8 books, each book 600 pages coming out, and it's the digitization of not just the good copies of chants, but also all their rough draft recensions, all the stages of the chants. So these are being published in book form, but in very limited publication runs, so 300 copies.
You don't have like Georgian Chant.
Yeah, but the lead editors say that the books will be available on PDF, so they will go up on websites because they've been publicly sponsored, so they're going to be available, and that will be great because then they'll be widely accessible. The books up until now have been kind of privately digitized, printed as books, and sold in bookshops around Tbilisi and churches and so forth. So they've been a little bit difficult to access outside of Tbilisi. Even if you go to a region, you can't find them in Georgia, and it's hard to find them about too. But starting now, I think very soon, we're going to have a lot of Georgian chant in PDF form on the websites.
What about the ones that you transcribe to the media player that you let it? I mean, you probably have personal files of those. That's
Right, yeah, I mean, over the years that I've been involved, I've done hundreds of my own transcriptions.
Right.
And I'm happy to send them to anyone that I don't feel like it. But I don't have them on my website. And the reason for that is because I don't want to compete with these teams of editors in Georgia that are printing and publishing and selling the books. So mine are just for scholarly purposes. If anyone wants these 3 versions of the Japan CD, I'd be happy to. Other questions? Yes.
I'm interested in the tuning system. It seems that the steps are all larger than ours. Is this like a sort of pentatonic-like system, or was it invented in the 1880s, or where does it come from? What is it?
We don't know where it was invented. I don't think it was invented. I think that this is the sonic environment that Georgians grew up with, and it's been that way for centuries. And it's a heptatonic scale, basically. So in the chant system, the chant is, the octaves are equal. They are at the frequency. And then the octave is divided into 7 equal intervals. An equal heptatonic scale, we call it. So what it's kind of like a whole tone scale, except that each tone is not 200 cents, but 160. So they're like 3/4 steps. In between, a half step would be 100 cents, and a whole step, 200 cents, right? So this is somewhere in between, 160 cents. I wonder if any of our singers can sing a scale, a Georgian scale. So about
One thing with the French in voices is much more easy to make with the old tuning.
Pani Mozart,
This is Siqvarulman, this is maybe the
I'm putting him on the spot. This is Zura, our choir director, and he's very talented.
First of all, there are some different versions for the scholars. It's going to be the old Georgian tuning, but me personally, I most of all like version of the Shemokmedi. I can tell you this, they say that the so then we're going to be at the scale with the same intervals between. I'm not sure. Like this.
You can't have a perfect fit.
You do have a perfect fit.
You can't get better by the
Yeah, there's 170 in there. So this is the tough thing for theorists. As Zura said, there are competing theories on how this works because it's not one singer. If it was one singer singing a monophonic melody, then it would be easier to sort of construct a scale. 3 singers singing together with different chordal arrangements, and it's close harmony. So what you get is the middle voice singing this kind of an A, and then 2 chords later, they're singing an A that's slightly different. And the reason is because they're harmonizing a different note in the top voice. If the A here is harmonizing a fifth under an E, then it's usually a perfect fit. But if then the top voice singing a B, and now you're singing what should be a whole tone underneath it, it's going to be slightly different than the say over here. So that's why it gets quite difficult. But we do have some scholars coming in now with digital technology and a lot of computer systems and mapping out the 3-voice harmony and trying to construct the theory. So that's a whole other element of Georgian Chant Studies and folk studies that's happening.
It's all blue.
Huh?
It's all blue.
All blue notes. No, with this kind of heptatonic scale, you tend to get fifths and fourths that sound familiar, and then you get very neutral thirds, very neutral sixths and sevenths. So, I think that we should conclude for the evening, and if you have any more questions, we are here for another 2 days.
You can stay and talk, but I think some people need to go.
I'll just make a plug for our concert tonight, 7 o'clock, right here. We have a great program. Sacred songs in the first half and folk songs in the second half. So
Yeah, it's right here. Because
Thank you. Just a short announcement from you, please. First of all, thank John for this lecture and for the discussions with professional live Georgian music. And since 2016, Georgian Chant Foundation established Ekaterine international competition for performers and researchers. And I hope once some students from Sitqvisa will apply to it, and we have a nomination with this year for scholarly publication. Yes, and the prize is approximately $800. And we'll send next, it will be announced in the next year in 2020. It's annual. Georgian. Thanks.